Close your eyes, if they are not closed already, and let me take you to a house on the banks of the Thames, a little way upriver from London, in a village called Mortlake. It is night. It has been night for some hours now, and will be night for some hours more. And in an upstairs room, a candle is burning low, its flame leaning first one way and then another, as a draught finds its way in through an old window frame. The room is lined, floor to ceiling, with books. Not a shelf here and there, not a modest collection such as a gentleman might keep to look learned at dinner, but thousands of them, more than any private person in England owns, spines cracked from use, pages soft at the corners where a hand has turned them again and again. There are star charts pinned to the wall. There is a globe, its oceans only half discovered. There is a mirror of polished black stone, and if you did not know what it was for, you might think it simply an ornament, something a wealthy man had brought back from a journey abroad. You would be wrong. That stone has work to do. Its owner believes, quite sincerely, that if he sits before it long enough and asks the right questions in the right frame of mind, something on the other side of the world, or perhaps the other side of this one, will answer him. Outside, the Thames moves past in the dark, carrying the last of the day's traffic downriver toward London, barges and small boats making their slow way home, their lanterns reflected and broken apart on the black water. Somewhere a dog barks twice and falls silent. The house itself seems to hold its breath, the way old houses do at this hour, as though it too is listening for whatever the man at the desk is waiting to hear. This is the house of John Dee, and I want to tell you his story tonight, slowly, the way it deserves to be told, because it is a story that keeps changing shape depending on where you choose to stand while you look at it. Stand in one place and you see a mathematician, a genuine scholar, a man who helped a struggling little island nation dream of becoming an empire. Stand in another and you see a courtier who read the stars for 2 queens and staked his freedom more than once on what he found there. Move again and you see something stranger still, a man in a candlelit room asking a piece of polished stone to put him in touch with angels, and receiving, so he believed, an answer. All 3 of these men were the same man. That is what makes him worth an evening of your attention. So settle in, let the weight of the day fall away from you, and let us begin at the beginning, in an England that was changing faster than most people realised, where old certainties were giving way to new ideas, and where one boy, born at precisely the right moment, would grow up to stand at the crossroads between them. He was born in London in the summer of 1527, the son of a minor court official, the kind of family with just enough connection to the machinery of power to hope for something more without any guarantee of getting it. It was a modest beginning for a life that would eventually touch 2 royal courts and reach as far as the imperial palace in Prague, though nobody watching the boy in those early years could have known that. Whatever ambition took root in him, it found its first proper soil at Cambridge, at St. John's College, where the young Dee threw himself into his studies with an intensity that unsettled some of the people around him. Contemporaries would later remember a young man who seemed to need almost no sleep, who kept candles burning long after his fellow students had given up for the night, working through texts most of them had abandoned as too difficult or too strange to bother with. He was reading everything. Mathematics, certainly, but also astronomy, geography, the classical philosophers, and increasingly the stranger corners of scholarship, where mathematics shaded into something that looked, to the unlettered eye, uncomfortably like magic. There is a story from these years that I find myself returning to, because it tells you something true about how Dee would be perceived for the rest of his life, regardless of what he actually did or believed. The university staged a production of an old Greek comedy, Aristophanes' Piece, and young Dee, already known for his ingenuity, built a mechanical device for the performance, a flying beetle that appeared to carry an actor up into the air above the stage, entirely through his own cleverness with pulleys and counterweights. The audience gasped. Word went round Cambridge that the device could not possibly have been made by ordinary means. Surely, people whispered, there was something uncanny in it. A young man who could make an actor fly must have help from somewhere other than mathematics. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is the shape of Dee's whole life in miniature. He does something clever, something explicable, something that a modern audience would recognise instantly as engineering rather than sorcery. And the world around him reaches immediately for the darker explanation. This was the 16th century's peculiar affliction. Mathematics itself, the discipline we now teach to children without a second thought, was regarded with genuine suspicion, seen by many as a kind of gateway, a discipline that studied the hidden relationships between numbers and the heavens and might, if a man went too far into it, tip over into something forbidden. Dee spent his whole career walking that boundary, sometimes deliberately, sometimes because the boundary itself kept shifting beneath his feet, and he seems to have understood, even as a very young man, that his gifts would always be a little suspect, that brilliance of his particular kind would never be allowed to simply exist without explanation. People would always want to know where it came from, and the true answer, hard work and a restless mind, rarely satisfied them. After Cambridge, he travelled to the continent, to Louvain, where he came into contact with some of the finest mathematical and geographical minds in Europe, men like Gemma Frisius and the cartographer Gerardus Mercator, whose maps were beginning to reshape how Europeans understood the shape of their own world. Dee absorbed all of it, walking the streets of a foreign university town filled with instrument makers and printers, and travellers passing through with news of lands most Englishmen had never heard of. He came home a genuinely formidable scholar, his reputation already reaching beyond England's shores. And for a while it must have seemed as though his path forward was simply going to be the path of the brilliant young academic, admired, occasionally envied, gradually rising through the quiet channels of scholarly reputation. That was not the path history had in mind for him. England in the 1550s was not a comfortable place to be clever in the wrong way at the wrong moment. Henry VIII was dead. His young son Edward had briefly worn the crown and then died himself, and now the throne belonged to Mary, Henry's elder daughter, a fiercely Catholic queen presiding over a country still raw from decades of religious upheaval, a queen who saw enemies, real and imagined, everywhere she looked. And in 1555, John Dee found himself arrested. The charge on the surface sounds almost absurd to modern ears. He was accused of calculating. That word, so mild to us now, carried real danger in Mary's England, because what Dee had actually been doing was casting horoscopes. And among the horoscopes he had cast were ones for Mary herself and for her younger half-sister, the Princess Elizabeth, who was at that time living under a cloud of royal suspicion, watched constantly for any sign that she might become the focus of a plot against her sister's throne. To calculate a queen's horoscope was, in the paranoid climate of the day, uncomfortably close to predicting her death, or worse, to actively working toward it. The accusations against Dee did not stop at calculating. They escalated, as such things did in that period, into something far graver: treason, plotting against the Queen's own life. He was brought before the Star Chamber, that infamous court that sat within the walls of the Palace of Westminster, a place with a fearsome reputation for swift and severe judgment, where a man might find that the ordinary protections of the law bent a little under the weight of royal displeasure. I want you to imagine him there, a young scholar, not yet 30, standing in a room designed to make him feel small, its high windows letting in a cold northern light. The men who would decide his fate seated above him in judgment, answering questions about mathematics and stars and the workings of his own mind, knowing that the wrong answer, or even the right answer delivered with the wrong tone, could see him burned as a heretic or hanged as a traitor. This was not an abstract danger. Mary's reign would become notorious for exactly that fate befalling men and women whose only crime was believing the wrong thing, or being suspected of believing it. He would have known, standing there, the names of others who had not walked free from rooms like this one. Dee survived. The common law judges eventually found no substance in the treason charge and let it fall away, but that was not quite the end of it, because he was passed on afterward for religious examination by a man whose name alone was enough to make Protestant England shudder. Bishop Edmund Bonner, remembered by history as one of the most zealous and feared enforcers of Catholic orthodoxy in Mary's reign, a man under whose authority a great many people met terrible ends. And here is where Dee's story takes one of its most interesting turns. The sort of turn that tells you a great deal about the kind of survivor he was. Rather than simply enduring Bonner's scrutiny and hoping to be released, Dee made himself useful to the man. He became, by some accounts, something close to an associate, even a friend, to the very figure who might otherwise have destroyed him. Whether this was calculation on Dee's part, or genuine intellectual rapport, or simple survival instinct dressed up as friendship, we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that it worked. Dee walked free from a period in English history that consumed a great many people less careful or less lucky than he was. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet after that danger has passed, to notice something about Dee that will recur again and again through the rest of his life. He was, again and again, a man who found himself standing extremely close to catastrophe, and who kept, through some combination of cleverness and charm and sheer good fortune, stepping back from the edge at the very last moment. Not everyone around him would be so fortunate, but Dee, somehow, always seemed to find the narrow path through, as though some part of him had a genuine instinct for exactly how far a thing could be pushed before it broke. 3 years later, in 1558, the country changed again. Mary died, and the throne passed to the sister whose horoscope had once put Dee in such danger, the young Elizabeth, now queen in her own right. And rather than remembering Dee as the man whose calculations had once been treated as treasonous, Elizabeth remembered him as something else entirely, a man whose knowledge of the stars might be exactly the kind of counsel a new monarch needed. She summoned him, and among the very first tasks she set him was one of extraordinary significance. She asked him to choose the date of her coronation. I want you to understand what that request really meant in the world Dee and Elizabeth inhabited. This was not decoration, not a courtly nicety extended to a scholar for the sake of appearances. In an age when the alignment of the stars was believed by many, including monarchs, to genuinely shape the fortunes of nations, the date on which a queen was crowned was thought capable of colouring the entire reign that followed. Choose wrongly, and you might doom a country to famine, rebellion, defeat in war. Choose well, and the stars themselves might smile on your rule. Elizabeth placed that responsibility, quite literally the fortune of her kingdom, as she and her advisers understood it, into the hands of a man who 3 years earlier had been standing trial for his life. She settled on the 15th of January, 1559, on Dee's calculation, and was duly crowned upon it, beginning a reign that would stretch on for over 4 decades and come, in time, to be remembered as something close to a golden age. From this moment, Dee's fortunes rose in earnest. He became something like an unofficial philosopher to the crown, a man Elizabeth herself is said to have called her philosopher, consulted not only on astrological matters, but drawn steadily into the wider currents of Elizabethan statecraft. It was around this time that he settled properly at Mortlake and began building the library that would come to define the middle years of his life, a collection that swelled eventually past 4,000 volumes, the largest private library anywhere in England, larger by far than either of the great universities could offer a scholar working alone. Visitors came from across Europe to see it. Ambassadors, natural philosophers, men of genuine international reputation, all making the journey to a house on the Thames to sit among Dee's books and instruments and talk with him about the shape of the world. Picture the rooms of that house in daylight now, rather than by candle, sunlight falling through leaded windows onto open pages, the murmur of learned conversation drifting from room to room, visitors tracing their fingers along spines that had come from Antwerp, from Venice, from Paris, gathered over decades by a man who seemed unable to stop reaching for one more book, one more fragment of understanding. And the shape of the world in these years was very much on Dee's mind, in a way that reached far beyond his own study. England in the middle of the 16th century was a country only beginning to imagine itself as a power upon the wider stage, watching enviously as Spain and Portugal carved up the newly discovered lands across the Atlantic and grew rich upon what they found there. Dee became one of the most passionate voices arguing that England ought to claim its own share of that wider world, and he did not merely argue for it in the abstract. He produced detailed reports for the Queen's advisers on the state of the nation and its prospects for expansion. He advised and financially supported the navigator Martin Frobisher on his voyages in search of a northern passage to Asia. He worked on the mathematics of navigation itself, the instruments and calculations that would let English ships cross open ocean with something more than hope to guide them. And in his writing from this period, he used, for what is believed to be the very first time in the English language, a phrase that would go on to define centuries of British history and identity: the British Empire. Dee coined it in these Mortlake years, imagining an empire that did not yet exist, built on ships that had not yet sailed, to lands the English had not yet reached, a country of the mind long before it ever became a country of the map. It is a strange thing to sit with, isn't it, in the stillness of the night, that the man remembered chiefly for talking to angels in a candlelit room was also, in the very same years, one of the architects of an idea that would shape the modern world in ways far more concrete and lasting than anything the angels ever told him. But the angels were coming. They had, in truth, always been somewhere in Dee's mind, waiting. Because for all his mathematics, all his charts and instruments and practical schemes for empire, there remained in Dee a hunger that none of it satisfied. He wanted to know, not merely to calculate. He wanted direct knowledge, the kind that mathematics could gesture toward but never quite deliver. Some unifying truth beneath the visible world that ordinary scholarship could only circle at a distance. He had written, some years before, a strange and difficult text called the Monas Hieroglyphica, in which he laid out a single symbol he had devised, a glyph combining the signs of the sun, the moon, the elements and fire, which he believed contained within its geometry something close to the secret structure of the universe itself. It was admired by some of the sharpest minds of the age, and understood fully, perhaps, by none of them, Dee included. It marks the moment where the mathematician begins, quite deliberately, to reach past mathematics, no longer satisfied with describing the world, and beginning instead to search for whatever lay beneath its description. By the 1580s, that reaching had become something more deliberate still. Dee had come to believe that ordinary study, however diligent, could take him only so far, and that if he wished to understand the true workings of creation, he would need to go directly to the source. He would need to speak with angels. Now Dee himself did not believe he possessed the gift required for this. He was, by his own understanding, a scholar and a mathematician, not a natural visionary. What he needed was someone else, a medium, a scryer, someone with the particular sensitivity to gaze into a polished surface, that black mirror I described to you earlier, or a crystal, and see and hear things that Dee himself could not. He tried several such men over the years, with mixed and often disappointing results, sitting through long, unproductive sessions that yielded little more than vague impressions and half-formed phrases, until in 1582 he found the man whose name would become permanently entwined with his own, Edward Kelley. I will be honest with you about Kelley, because I think the honesty matters to the story. History has not been kind to him, and probably rightly so. He arrived in Dee's life already trailing a reputation for dishonesty, and there is a considerable body of opinion, both among Dee's contemporaries and among historians since, that Kelley was, at least in significant part, a fraud, a man skilled at telling an eager and brilliant scholar exactly what that scholar most wanted to hear. But whatever Kelley truly was, whatever mixture of genuine conviction and calculated performance lay behind his visions, Dee believed in him for years, with a completeness that is almost painful to look back on now, the way a man of such formidable intellect could hand over so much of his judgment to another person's word. Together the two men began a series of sessions that Dee recorded with the same meticulous scholarly care he brought to everything else in his life, sessions in which Kelley, gazing into the stone, would report seeing and hearing angelic beings, who spoke to him in a language unlike any spoken on earth. Over time, working from what Kelley claimed to receive, the two men assembled an entire alphabet, an entire grammar for this celestial tongue. It became known as Enochian, and Dee filled volume after volume with its words, its structures, its supposed meanings, convinced that he was recording nothing less than the language spoken in the courts of heaven, perhaps even the very language Adam had spoken before his fall from Eden. Picture the two of them, night after night, in that same candlelit room at Mortlake, or later in stranger rooms in stranger countries. Kelley bent over the stone, murmuring what he claimed to see, his voice dropping and rising as though genuinely straining to hear something at the very edge of audibility. Dee at his side with pen and paper, transcribing every syllable with the patient precision of a man who had once catalogued 4,000 books, pausing only to ask a clarifying question, to request that a word be repeated, treating the whole strange exercise with the unhurried rigour of a scientific experiment. It is one of the most peculiar partnerships in the whole of English history, a genuine mathematical genius and a man many believe to be a con artist. together producing thousands of pages of a language that either came from somewhere beyond this world or came from nowhere at all beyond one clever man's imagination. In 1583, the two of them, along with their families, left England altogether and began a long, unsettled journey across the continent, first to Poland and then onward into Bohemia, drawn by the hope of patronage from the great courts of Central Europe, where interest in alchemy, astrology, and the occult ran even hotter than it did at home. They spent time at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II in Prague, a ruler famous across Europe for his fascination with exactly the kind of work Dee and Kelley were engaged in. A city that in these years was drawing alchemists and mystics and mathematicians from every corner of the continent, all hoping to find, in Rudolf's patronage, the freedom and funding to pursue their strangest ideas. Imagine that city as Dee would have known it. Narrow streets rising toward a castle on the hill, workshops behind unmarked doors where men bent over furnaces and retorts long into the night, a whole capital quietly humming with the same restless hunger that had driven Dee from his own library in the first place. It was during these continental years that the partnership between Dee and Kelley produced its darkest and strangest episode, the one that even now, centuries later, people still find themselves returning to with a kind of uneasy fascination. Kelley claimed that the angels had delivered a command, that the two men and their wives should share everything between them, including their marriage beds. I will not dwell on this too long tonight, because it sits heavily, and this is not the hour for heaviness, but I will say this much. Dee, a man of genuine and by most accounts sincere religious faith, wrestled visibly with the instruction in his own diaries, torn between his trust in what he believed to be genuine angelic communication and his own evident discomfort with what was being asked of him. Whatever happened between the two households in the end, the episode marks the beginning of the unravelling between the two men. Trust, once so complete, had begun to fray, the way trust often does, quietly at first, and then all at once. By 1589, after 7 years of partnership, 7 years of shared visions and shared travel and shared upheaval, the two men parted ways. Kelley remained on the continent, drawn ever deeper into the alchemical world of Rudolf's court, chasing now the promise of the philosopher's stone itself, the old alchemical dream of transforming base metal into gold. Dee turned for home, back across a Europe he had crossed with such hope 6 years before, back toward Mortlake, back toward the library and the life he had left behind. What he found waiting for him there was not the homecoming he might have hoped for. In his long absence, his house had been broken into. His extraordinary library, that great collection gathered over decades, visited by scholars from across the continent, had been ransacked, books stolen or scattered, instruments damaged or gone entirely. It is a quietly devastating image, isn't it, if you let yourself sit with it? A man returns after years abroad, chasing angels through foreign courts, and finds that the earthly treasure he had spent his whole life assembling, the actual physical foundation of his scholarly reputation, has been picked apart in his absence by people who understood nothing of its worth beyond whatever they could sell it for. He must have stood in those half-emptied rooms, among the gaps on the shelves where whole sections of his life's work had simply vanished, and felt something in him go quiet in a way that even the Star Chamber, all those years before, had not quite managed to achieve. He tried, in the years that followed, to rebuild something of his former standing. Elizabeth, to her credit, had not entirely forgotten him, and there were periods where he found himself once again drawn into royal service, consulted on matters both practical and occult. But the world around him was shifting, and shifting in a direction that no longer had much room for a man like Dee. When Elizabeth herself died in 1603, and the throne passed to James, the new king brought with him a marked distaste for exactly the kind of magical and astrological thinking that had defined so much of Dee's career. James had, in earlier years, written at length against witchcraft and the occult arts, and a court presided over by such a king was never going to be a comfortable place for the Queen's old philosopher. Dee sought an audience, sought some renewal of the position and respect he had once commanded. It did not come. He was, gently but unmistakably, turned away, a whole era of his life closing quietly behind him with no ceremony at all. The final years crept by quietly, and by most accounts poverty crept in alongside them. The great library, even what remained of it after the vandalism, was gradually sold off, piece by piece, to keep body and soul together. The scholar reduced to parting with the very books that had once made his house the most visited private library in England. One imagines him in these last years, an old man in a much emptier house than the one we began this story in, the shelves thinner now, the candle perhaps burning just as late, but for very different reasons. Less a search for hidden knowledge now than simply the ordinary, aching business of getting through another night. He died sometime in the winter of 1608, or perhaps the early months of 1609, the exact date lost, in the manner of so much about him, somewhere between record and legend. He was buried at Mortlake in the parish church, though even the precise location of his grave has been lost to time, which feels, in its own way, strangely fitting for a man whose whole life sat so uneasily on the border between the recorded and the unrecorded, the provable and the merely believed. So what do we make of him, lying here in the dark, turning his story over one last time before sleep finally takes us? I think the honest answer is that we make of him whatever we came looking for. If you want a portrait of Elizabethan science at its most serious, he gives you that. A mathematician and navigator whose work genuinely shaped England's early ambitions on the world stage, whose phrase, the British Empire, would go on to outlive him by centuries and describe a reality he only ever dreamed of. If you want a portrait of a man undone by his own credulity, he gives you that too. A brilliant mind who spent years transcribing an invented angelic language from a man many considered an outright fraud, who let that same man's visions dictate decisions about his own marriage. And if you want simply a story of a life lived close to the fire, close to danger and grandeur in equal measure, arrested as a young man for treason and later trusted with the date of a queen's coronation, welcomed at the courts of emperors and later left to sell his own books to survive, then his story gives you that most fully of all. Perhaps the truth is that John Dee never fully chose between these versions of himself, and never quite needed to, because in his own mind they were not separate paths at all. The mathematics and the angels, the navigation charts and the black mirror, all of it belonged, for him, to a single unbroken search for the hidden order beneath the visible world. He simply never stopped looking, through every instrument available to him, right up until the very end, certain, or at least hoping, that somewhere beneath the surface of things, everything did in fact connect. The house at Mortlake is gone now, long since vanished beneath the changing shape of the city that grew up around it, swallowed by centuries of building and rebuilding until no trace of its foundations remains for anyone to find. The library that once drew scholars from across Europe was scattered centuries ago. its volumes finding their way, piece by piece, into other collections, other hands, some of them perhaps, sitting even now on a shelf somewhere, unrecognised, waiting, a fragment of that great Mortlake collection, quietly gathering dust in a library that has no idea what it holds. And somewhere in that darkness, if you believe the record he left behind, a conversation is still, in some sense, unfinished. A question asked into a stone by candlelight, all those centuries ago, still hanging in the space where an answer might, or might not, have come. Sleep well.